then we're like, oh, we'll label that conspiracy. He's a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Except most of those conspiracies now are turning out to be true.
Look at the Iraq War, the second one. It was sold to us about weapons of mass destruction. Never found. No accountability.
So what you're saying is that we don't really have history then. What we are left with is narrative. And that narrative morphs according to public perception.
I think that the next big wars will be something like reality wars, where people are fighting to determine what is true and what is not, and the kind of
reality wars. Great, sounds like a new genre of television. Right?
Right?
Welcome. I am joined today by my close friend and colleague, Michael Ashley. Michael is a phenomenal writer who's written over 40 books. He's got numerous publications. He's been a freelance journalist for a long time for very prestigious publications, and has been published many times with Forbes as well. We've worked on several projects together. He wrote a book called Own the AI Revolution, which I provided an endorsement on a few years back, and that book has been, well the world over, I guess. It's basically gone around the globe. And I'm excited to be here with you, Michael. And Michael and I wrote a book together that is now going to be coming out this summer called Neuromined, M-I-N-E-D, around the concept of your data is your value and your sovereignty. And right now it's presently getting mined by technocracies around the globe in the hands of only a few different companies, in fact. And we believe that that poses a significant threat to maintaining individuality, which we also think is one of the most important aspects and the most valuable assets in the entire universe itself. Every individual being able to provide their own unique perspective on their universal experience. So thank you, Michael. Great to have you here with me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you got into this and how you started to get passionate about this topic of owning your AI revolution, owning your identity, making sure that that you're protected, especially in this environment and world right now, which is extremely vitriolic and polarized.
Right. Well, I think you would tell me there are no coincidences. And as a child, I grew up loving science fiction. And my undergrad was in philosophy. And so I was always very interested in big ideas. And science fiction allows big ideas to happen in a way that's entertaining and compelling. But I really wasn't writing about this subject until 2018. And that's when Neil Sahota, who was on the team that created IBM Watson, he came to me with that book idea, which later became Own the AI Revolution. And so that book came out. The UN actually launched it at their AI for Good conference back in 2019. And so as part of writing that book, I got to interview many people, actually 32 people. You were one of them. You were very kind to endorse the book. And so as I began writing that book, I also began writing for Forbes about AI and big data. And I really began to learn about the whole issue regarding data sovereignty. And so I think you and I met in either late 2018 or early 2019.
I think.
And so it was really eye-opening, in fact, when I began working with you to see the ways that our data is being misappropriated from us, the fact that there is a lot more power on their side than our side. And then I just continued to want to write about this issue. The book that we did together is the fourth book that I've done around the subject of artificial intelligence. And what I found is, even though this is something that dramatically affects us every day, most of the general public just doesn't understand it. And I think it's often the case that it's based on the language we use.
Right.
We don't even have the right language. And I'll give you an example. Surveillance Capitalism comes from a book of the same title by Shoshana Zuboff. And until I read that book, I didn't even have a term to explain what was going on. And so that's how I began to be involved in this subject.
Wow. So how important is this topic, though? I think it's one of those things that people don't realize what's happening. We're kind of all like Neo in the Matrix, and we're being plugged in. And instead of it being energy that's being drawn for the batteries, right, that we, I guess, could be providing, like in the movie The Matrix, it's the information.
Right.
And the mining of that information becomes highly valuable, which is also kind of interesting because even in physics, there's something called mass energy information equivalency. All three are believed to be equal in some way, shape, or form. It could be through reciprocity as well. But information equaling energy means that we literally are like in the Matrix.
Right.
If we're providing information. So what does that mean to you? And how important is this for humanity at this point in time?
Well, we've been often told that this is the information age. And so if you think about, we had the industrial age, we have the information age right now. It leads us to believe that this is the most important part of our economy right now. We know that data is now the most valuable commodity. And so information is everything that a modern person's life is built upon. If you're like anyone else today, you probably have looked at your phone more than 24 times at least, right? And so we have information coming to us in the form of text and social media posts, videos, these types of things. And really, if you think about it, we've been told that we are the product when it comes to social media posts. We had ability to go on and use apps like Facebook and Snapchat and TikTok, but really we're the product. It's apt that we chose that title for the book Neuromined because our brains are being mined for the content within them. But it goes even further than that. One thing that came out of Shoshana Zuboff's book, that goes back to behavioralists like B.F. Skinner, who talked about this idea that it's not just passive information, it's information meant to nudge you in a certain direction. And of course, B.F. Skinner wasn't alive to see this, but we can. We can see it in the ways that Facebook has been changing elections or changing the behavior of people that affects elections. We see it in the ways that what happens online, let's say that you gather information or someone has a post or a meme or whatever, it doesn't just exist digitally, it affects you in real life. So information isn't just being mined and pulled from us. Information is being used to
like
change.
Inception.
Well, that's it. Change our behavior. Put it that way.
And modify and titrate our behaviors.
Sure, absolutely.
So this is really interesting because one of the things that really hit me when we were writing the book was that a small handful of companies literally know what I will do before I do it.
Yes.
So one of the things I found was that one of the guys that works in the office with me ran for Congress on the last cycle. He unfortunately lost, but he's going to run again. Looks like he might end up winning this time. But basically, I asked him, I said, what kind of apps do you have at your disposal? What kind of technology do you guys use to be able to find out, who you're meeting with when you're going to have a luncheon or something, and we're trying to get campaign financing or obviously out on the campaign trail.
Right.
And what he told me about was this app that he had access to that all congressional leaders and candidates running for office have access to. And he tells me that every single adult age person in the United States is on this database. And he said, it contains all kinds of information on every one of us, on you, Robert. And I said, what kind of information? So he takes out his phone and shows it to me. There were 56 pages on me alone.
Right.
56 pages on me. It knew everything about me. Not only my address and everything, but my political stance on everything. And guess where all the data came from? My messaging apps. Just based on the kind of comments I was making. So we think that these messaging apps that are encrypted are actually safe. They're not. They're mining your data and selling it to app projects like this one. And so I was looking through the list and I was stunned at the level of detail and nuance it even had. So as an example, it said that I was more religious leaning. Now, I don't consider myself religious by any stretch of the imagination, but the reason why I was considered religious leaning is because my children go to a private school. And because they're in private school, I will likely vote in favor of those kind of like referendums, et cetera, that are going to be most beneficial to that constituency. It also said that I was a hawk on China. I was also a hawk on COVID, that I made my employees come back to work after the COVID lockdowns were over. So as soon as the lockdowns were over, I made all the employees come back. It knew this about me. Another thing it knew was my position on abortion, that generally I'm for a woman's right to choose, but not for late stage pregnancy. And it defined exactly where I was on that topic. I never told anybody this.
Right.
How did it know all this? It's captured so much data on me. It knew every single election how I voted. I don't vote party lines. I'll vote Republican, I'll vote Democrat. I vote candidate and principle. So I'm an independent, but it knew everything about me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of scary, because what if we lived in a world like 1984 where there is a ministry of truth? Oh, wait, we just created a ministry of truth.
Yeah.
Biden administration just created a ministry of truth. And there's even a ministry of truth that just came forward now in the UK. Mm-hmm. They have a new BBC station called Verify, mm-hmm. which is essentially a ministry of truth. So as I kind of looked at all this, I was immediately starting to think, like, do you ever see that movie 2012? It's like the end of the Mayan calendar. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there was this one guy in there that had like tinfoil on his head.
Yes.
And he was like living out in some trailer somewhere. Mm-hmm. And he still got the tinfoil on his head. And then, all the craziness is going down. He's like, I was right. and I just saw a meme yesterday, which is like, okay, Elon Musk was speaking and he said, he goes, well, the thing with the conspiracy theories is so many of them turned out to be true. And then they started listing out all the ones that became true.
Yeah.
And I'm very much against conspiracy theory. I'm not for that at all. But it is kind of shocking how many things are being overturned right now.
Sure.
So how are they getting all this data?
Well, how are they getting it?
Because if they can predict what we're going to do, they can titrate what we do to change what we do.
Well, the irony, for those that don't know, I mean, first of all, the military created the internet, right? And so we got the more...
I thought that was Al Gore.
Well, yes, and we put in a lockbox
Okay.
as well. So the interesting thing about it was, they're trying to use it for defense and, of course, offense as well. And if you think about it, if you go back to, let's say, a totalitarian like Chairman Mao or Stalin, right? So they were using physical force, brutality, to control their populations, which is pretty much the way that most tyrants have run their countries for a long time. But the wisest among them realized you don't have to have a standing force. You don't have to use brutality, although you can. That's still on the table. What you can do instead goes back to a book called Propaganda by Edward Bernays. And so the most effective way to control people at scale is to control their minds, the way that they think. But if you try to collect all this information, because, that's the way that people might have thought about that in the past, it's very difficult to collect all the information. Why not get people to do it voluntarily? And that's exactly what we did. We give our information voluntarily. If we're on social media, we're taking pictures of what we ate for breakfast. We're talking about where we go. There are places where you can check in and say where you've been. We are doing this unwittingly, or some of us, I guess, wittingly, and we're giving them all that information. But I'll give you another example. So Yuval Harari, who's a big insider on these things, this was out a few years ago, so you can imagine the technology is more advanced. You can determine if someone's their sexual tendencies based on just where they look. So if you were to watch, let's say we're watching Baywatch right now, and there's a man and a woman both in bathing suits right now, our eyes will dilate based on our sexual preference. This is just small things, but you imagine technology that can read micro expressions, which is their capabilities right now. I mean, they can do that from space. They can tell your micro expressions. So not only are we voluntarily giving this information, but the technology to track us is so sophisticated.
But I've always liked David Hasselhoff since he was a Knight Rider. I mean, it's been a long time. Love affair with David Hasselhoff. I'm joking.
Well, naturally, of course. And who wouldn't?
He's definitely got it on top of. He's definitely better, from that standpoint than Pamela Anderson. Sorry, Pamela. But anyway, the point is that this kind of data can be mined. How can they know how your eyes are dilating? You're saying there's cameras now and TVs and stuff?
Well, there are cameras.
Oh, wait. We're all watching YouTube now.
Me too.
So that could actually be used?
I mean,
have you ever seen this film on YouTube called The Selfish Ledger?
I think you mentioned to me. I have not seen it, though.
Holy moly, man. It is terrifying that the whole thing is about, everyone is kind of like part of this giant blockchain, and that they'll be able to monetize. And this is just an employee. It was supposed to be for only employees of Google. Mm-hmm. And they posted it on like YouTube. Mm-hmm. And it is terrible. It is shocking. It is the most dystopian thing I think I've ever seen. They literally look at us like we're lab rats. Uh-huh. And they speak of us that way too, with no rights to our own thinking, because they can control our thinking. Mm-hmm. So keep going what you're saying. This is fascinating stuff.
Well, I want to go back to the Ministry of Truth for a moment. And so within the chapter of the book that we did together, we called it Monopoly of Truth. And so, when we think about a dystopian nightmare, the first name that probably comes up is George Orwell. But what I think that even though as smart as he was, his ability to predict the future, and he was spot on, even he couldn't predict how far we would come technologically. And I'll give you an example. His protagonist, Winston Smith, works for, the Ministry of Truth, and his job is to redact, to physically block out words or burn them. Well, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just memory hold them. And so we've seen, in fact, we listed in the book that they changed the definitions of words. Inflation is a good example. The Biden administration changed the definition of inflation this past year. And so you can begin to change it digitally. You don't have to burn these books or get rid of them. You can do it in real time.
So what did Biden call inflation again?
Well, I think the technical definition is 2 quarters of decreased returns, going down.
Decreased productivity.
Yes, exactly. And so they said that we are not in it. And so they had a different definition for inflation. And so there are other things as well. They've changed the definitions. That's the ability that they have right now. And so, to go further with this idea, the example that we talk about in the book. So right now you can imagine the power that people have when you go on a field trip, right? Let's say you and I were to go to a field trip and we learn about the, let's say Lewis and Clark, and they're going across the country and they're finding out all these different places, right? As a kid, I did do that. I'm from St. Louis and we learned a lot about Lewis and Clark. Now the example that we give in the book, because we want to talk about the ability not just to mine people and to understand what we think, but also to nudge them and to affect their behavior. Now imagine this, you go on a field trip and you begin being told the wrong things. And when you're a child, you're quite impressionable. Not that you're not as an adult, but you're especially impressionable when you're a young person. And so the way that we wrote it in the book, for those that haven't yet read it, and it's coming out in July, they're on a field trip and they're being told all this false information. And then it goes on and goes on. But finally you realize they're not even in reality. They're in the metaverse. So you can imagine the kind of power, the centralized control that these people will have when we begin not just using the internet two-dimensionally on our phones and screens, but when we're living in the metaverse where you can change consensus reality based on the information that you're receiving, or more to the point that you're experiencing.
Interesting. Wow. So this means that they can literally change how we vote by selective disclosure and selective omission. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like if I stop or I cut back somebody and shadow ban a concept, right? So let's say the true definition of inflation, just use that as an example.
Sure.
If I shadow ban the concept of the true definition of inflation, then I could literally change history.
Of course.
And impact the future at the same time.
Well, I'll go one further. And so if you think about the way that we understand history, one of my favorite authors, his name is Chuck Klosterman. And so he has a book called What If We're Wrong? And he likes to play this game at the bar. And he says, tell me someone famous in the 21st century. And that's pretty easy to do. 20th century, that's pretty easy to do. 19th century, pretty good. By the time you get to the 16th century, most people can't name one famous person. And so if you look at any of the events
I would definitely say Leonardo.
Okay, well, yes. So,
I'd say John D. I can think of several, but
all the way down to the first century, it gets a little bit harder and harder. People do not know it. So if you take events,
then there's only Jesus.
Right. So if you take the events of the last few years, the contentious ones, and I don't care what people's beliefs are on either side of these issues, whether it's January 6th, whether it's the George Floyd situation, the murder, and then of course what happened afterwards. All of these things were video recorded. We have video footage of this, and yet we cannot come to consensus on what occurred. Now, what happens when many, many years pass? So right now you're talking about changing an election. I'm talking about what happens, let's say 100 years from now. And you have this kind of control that you can change the narrative and you can memory hold something that didn't happen or did happen. What can you do to a culture? Not just change who people vote for, but change your entire conception of history. What happened?
So what you're saying is that we don't really have history then. What we are left with is narrative. Mm-hmm. And that narrative morphs according to public perception.
Yes, but I'll add one more thing, which is this. But narrative is also our most powerful weapon, if you ask me, is narrative. If you think, even going back to Edward Bernays for just a moment, our beliefs are probably one of the strongest things to change, or the hardest things to change. You talked about religion just a moment ago. You talked about abortion. Again, I don't care what people's opinions are on either side of the aisle for these things, but people are very motivated by their beliefs. And where do beliefs come from? They come from the myths, the stories that we tell, the narratives that we create. And right now we have a narrative. We have many narratives going on in our culture. One of which, of course, is scarcity. We've long been told that there just isn't enough. Another one is, let's say, Malthusian economics, that there isn't enough to go around. All of these are narratives that people have bought in to a certain degree. Now, what if you have a different narrative? Right now, we're taught or meant to believe by the powers that be that we don't have power, that we have little agency, we are meant to be demoralized. But this central theme, in fact, we talk about in the last chapter of the book, is that we can change the story. We can change the story at any time, beginning with our words. And if we begin to change the story, we begin to change our consensus reality.
So, well, that's kind of the concept that, be the change you want to see in the world. Basically, that's an operating principle of that, which is change your perception and you will change your world experience.
Yes.
And it can be used in a negative dystopian way, or it can be used in a positive, empowering way.
Yes.
And this is probably why also, there are many times in my life, I look back at my life and I say, geez, that was a difficult situation. Then with the passage of a few months or years, I look back on those same exact circumstances and my perception of what it was changes dramatically. The polarity of the experience almost flips to the opposite direction. That it always ends up that I realized, whoa, that was like the toughest time, but that was like the best thing that ever happened to me.
Right.
And that might just be because I'm an optimist in general.
Sure.
Right. But it transmutes the experience from something very negative and painful and heartbreaking to something that can be quite an incredibly powerful learning experience.
Right.
And that's what I'm here for, is for those learning experiences. It's like I read something recently. The ego is what breaks. The heart never breaks. The heart only expands. And as we learn through things, and I've always said this, I believe that the only mistakes that we make in life are the things we didn't actually learn from. Right? And I think we have an opportunity to learn from virtually everything.
Yes.
But when we think about this, it feels like mankind right now is on the precipice of something very profound, because it means that what we have considered objective truth, we now come to the realization that it was always narrative. And some of that narrative was our own conditioning bias. But you can use the conditioning biases for a segment of a population, a core demographic, to be able to mold and cancel. You can basically cancel history.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what happened with Chairman Mao, right? In the Cultural Revolution in China,
right,
with the Communist Party.
Absolutely.
And it's exactly what's happening now.
Right. And I think the danger we have right now is the sense of wanting a cultural amnesia, right? And of course, there are terrible things that have happened in the world, and we have monuments to them. We have flags to them. And so I think it's very dangerous, this idea to get rid of them because they can be triggering. So right now in our colleges, unfortunately, we have something called microaggressions, things that trigger people in their safe spaces, right? And so the idea behind some of this movement is that in order to preserve safety, especially emotional safety, we should remove these things because they are abhorrent or they trigger us, right? But I would say that that instead we should be looking at these things and reminding ourselves why they happened so that we can prevent them. And I'll give you an example. I mean, most of my family died in the Holocaust right now. And so I worked on a book not long ago, and there was my co-author and I talked about this idea. What would happen? Should we have a picture of Hitler, right? Would that be triggering to someone who went through the Holocaust, have that in a museum? And I still come down on the idea that even though this was the atrocities that came out of Hitler, no one would say he's a great person at this point, but we have to know where we came from so that we don't make the same mistakes. And I would suggest that many, many mistakes have been made in the last 20 years, both under the so-called war on terror, the war on drugs, what we've experienced over the last 3 years when it comes to COVID. And if we just wipe the slate clean, we can't learn. We can't do what you just said a moment ago. You said you have been able to look at things in your past, things that weren't fun to live through, but you're able to grow from them. And I think that we need those things out there. We need to know where we made mistakes so that we can tell a better story about who we are. So,
I'm going to, at the risk of upsetting some people, I guess, I'm going to give an example that I had just last night. I'm very interested in Egyptology. So I was on Netflix last night and I turned on the story of Cleopatra, which is like a documentary style thing. And I found it fascinating because there's been this whole controversy with, I think it was Disney, who, ended up casting a black woman, right, as Cleopatra after a lot of fervor and controversy around. I don't even know what the current status of that is. Okay, but what's fascinating to me is that in the Netflix docu series as well, she was cast as a black woman. Now, if you actually go back and read history, because she was, one of the more famous people in the 1st century BC. Okay, so she died probably 60 some odd years before our time of Jesus, right? So right at the crossover between BC and AD.
Right.
And they actually have a record of who her lineage was, what her lineage was. She was Ptolemaic, Greek, and Persian, predominantly. That is not black. And yet, we are now being told, and there were even people that made commentary on this,
right?
Because she was from Egypt, therefore she was black, and there were black people. Of course, there were black people in Egypt at the time. Of course, there were all different shades of brown people, and she probably looked somewhat Semitic, I'm sure, but definitely not necessarily black. And to make that such a controversial topic is exactly this concept of changing history. And it's no different than, allowing, this is the type of thinking that led to the Holocaust. This is the type of thinking that led to slavery. Because now there's this whole discussion going on right now as well that's coming out in the media about superior melanation, right? Which is like, wait, what? Right. This is another racial profiling thing. And we want to move away from that. I have so many very, very close black friends. And I talked to them about this, and they're sort of perplexed too. To be honest, they're very perplexed, and they call it out. But it's this ignorance of this narrative that is like literally being promulgated almost by some design.
Right.
Almost like AI is infiltrating through it, and it's basically spreading it like a virus or a contagion.
Yes.
And it's like a misinformation contagion under the guise of Ministry of Truth.
Right. Well, with that, I would say this, the big message, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is that the sense that we're all made in God's divine image, and we are more than what we think we are, right? But yet, if you think about these reductive theories, whether, this black person is better, or this white person, or this Asian person, or their religion, or whatever it is.
The good news is nobody's any better than anybody else.
Exactly.
Ever.
And so what I say, you talked about, at least I'm hearing this word, more like, I think about like an illusion or a distraction. I think about this like a magician's trick. Right now, we have real problems in this country, in this world. We have techno-fascism creeping in like we can't believe. I mean, this is beyond what Hitler or Mao or Stalin could ever imagine, the kind of power that we're talking about. We have that on the one hand over here. We have AI, which we haven't even talked about yet, but we have an explosion of AI. This is the year AI went mainstream. It's already on the 4th iteration. We have all those things. Now we also have declining birth rates all around the world, which Elon Musk has rightly sounded off about, that we are facing a dearth of workers in many countries and consumers. We have that, and a supply chain that is falling apart. And yet we're talking about these things here. And I think that a big reason is the magician's trick. Look over here while all this other stuff comes in, and people aren't talking about what I think are the real important issues. We spend so much time on all these things that make us more divided, more reasons to hate somebody. We talk about this in the book too, but on social media, we are consigned to echo chambers, and the algorithm picks more videos to even further cement our beliefs, to polarize us. And here we are talking about these things, but instead we're not talking about the issues of the book that we wrote together that we need to be talking about. And that's just one small thing of the challenges that we face. And so when I hear you say that, I have been following this a little bit, but I have to believe that all this is meant to keep us at each other's throats, to keep us fighting with each other instead of talking about the real issues that matter.
Yeah, it is super fascinating to me. So let's go into some of those real issues that matter, and maybe you can give us some examples that we illustrated in the book.
Sure.
That, maybe I love the story when, the guy is driving and he gets pulled over by a cop. And the cop tells him, "Oh, you're driving and you're not allowed to be driving because this is a self-driving vehicle." So take us into that story.
Sure. Well, the idea behind this, and by the way, the technology is here. We have in any given car at this point, there are 40 to 50 computers. They call it the IoT, the Internet of Things. And some people believe that the journalist Michael Hastings, who died more than a decade ago, he was investigating some very sensitive stuff about the government, and his car had a very mysterious way that it went off, and he ended up dying and being killed in his car. And some people believe that they've had this technology for a long time where essentially they can shut the car down. And so right now, there are things called 15-minute cities. They rolled them out already in places like Oxfordshire, England. And so we wanted to talk about this idea where essentially you think about the car and what that meant as a symbol for America, the idea of freedom and mobility, right? Well, if the powers that be have their way, they will be kill switches in all these cars, and those 40-something computers will talk to the government and shut it down. And so the example that we give, because we really want people to understand this, and I should back up and say the way that we wrote the book, first of all. Robert and I had this idea behind this that, when we talk about techno-fascism or computers or social media, it can go over some people's heads. And we didn't want people to feel like this was an intellectual exercise, but it doesn't affect them. And so we wanted people to feel emotionally invested. We want them to feel viscerally connected to the people. And so every chapter has a show and a tell. And the show that you were mentioning earlier is the scene in which the father and his son are driving, and they're not supposed to be driving this car because every car is too dangerous to be driven by a human driver. It has to be a self-driving car, right? And then the tell part, of course, is the argument or the context to it. And so we wanted to also imagine something that can happen. I mean, it probably already is happening in places like China, but nowadays we know it when we're pulled over. The cop flashes their lights, and then we pull over. Well, in our story, the cops don't have to do that. Because of the computer, because of those 40 and 50 computers within the car, it literally pulls the car off the road. The cop can pull the car over, and as soon as the car pulls over, all the windows go down, and then they can tell the person what to do on the inside. Now, we didn't include this in the story, but I've also heard other examples that in the near future, if we all are on self-driving cars that are controlled by the government or whatever, if you have a warrant for your arrest, they'll just take you to the police station, no questions asked. And so with this example here, we want people to wake up to the idea that not only are they neuromining us, not only are they mining our data, not only are they nudging our behavior, but also they want to control our mobility. So going back to 15-minute cities, the idea is that everything that you would need would be within a 15-minute radius, your hospital, your stores, whatever. And if you were to exceed that 15 minutes in your car, either one or two things will happen. One, they shut down the car, just completely shut it down. Or two, if by that point we're all on the social credit system like they have in China, they will just deduct the money from your central bank digital currency account.
But here's another example. Here's something that just happened this weekend. I got a notification in the mail from the state of Wisconsin. Now, the last time I went to Wisconsin was probably 10 years ago. I flew there. Somehow, a car with the VIN number of my last car, which, I traded in and it's gone, ended up it was an Aston Martin, in Wisconsin. Had no license plate on it. Somehow it was ascribed to me. It got a parking ticket. So now they put a lien on my registration in the state of California. So I've never been to Wisconsin. It's clearly not my car, right? And yet they have a lien, and it's easier for me just to pay the $75 than it is to go through the process of disputing it. What the fuck?
Well, I'll go one step further. Let's say that with that story that you just told me, it could be about the car, but it could be about the book. Let's say that they want to say not only is Robert Grant a terrorist, he writes horrible books in which he says blah, 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 right? And you say, that's not me. Well, all they have to do is they take a few pictures from the internet, maybe you're on Facebook or whatever, and they create a deep fake video. And here you are in a large auditorium. Not only did you write that book, here you are speaking about the book that you wrote. And now how many people, even your friends and loved ones, are going to say, that's not Robert, he wouldn't do that. It could be very, very convincing. These deep fakes that they have right now, again, will change consensus reality. Oh,
yeah. No, I had a similar experience in 2019 when I spoke out on one topic in the cryptography field. And the company that was most at risk because of what I was highlighting as their vulnerability created a whole deep, dark web account
Mm-hmm.
And it was all complete BS.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in fact, they had me with my face superimposed on top of Adolf Hitler. I mean, give me a break. And it said underneath it, Heil Elon, which cracked me up. It was so ridiculous, in fact.
Yeah.
It was so crazy and so stupid. When I saw it, I just had to laugh.
Right.
It was so outlandish. So actually, they kind of curtailed it, brought it back, because I think they realized, wait, this looks so stupid.
Right.
You know, it was just like, has no credibility whatsoever. So they tried to make it look more legit.
Mm-hmm.
But this was just a smear campaign as part of a, industrial espionage exercise.
Sure.
Where they actually went to my house, went through my trash cans and everything, sent fake, basically people to crash my Christmas party. This was nuts. This shit exists, guys. I'm telling you, this exists. And we are kind of oblivious to it to a certain extent until we actually experience it. And then when somebody experiences it and we didn't, then we're like, oh, we'll label that conspiracy. He's a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Except most of those conspiracies now are turning out to be true.
Well, I'll go one step further. So, I mean, we were talking about deep fakes, and deep fakes, to me, is a problem. We've been talking about it culturally a little bit, but what you're talking about was about 4 years ago, right? The technology is so much better right now. And so there's a very famous case where there was a video gamer, a female video gamer. She was on Twitch, and someone made a porno of her and ruined her life.
Fake porn.
Fake porn, right? And so this is every parent's worst nightmare, to imagine your teenage son or daughter comes home, they created this video. And again, if you put yourself into where you were at the age of 13, 14, 15, right? As I said earlier, we're all impressionable throughout our lives, but we're really at the mercy of social forces, our friends, our peer group at that age. And what happens if a video comes out there and you say, no, that wasn't me. You said, well, that was my boyfriend and this was his revenge at me. That wasn't me. It doesn't change the fact that it ruined that person's life. So we have deep fake pornography happening. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there are kidnappers right now that are creating deep fakes of children for ransom to unsuspecting parents. But I'll go one step further, and I hate even mentioning it because I don't want someone to copy it, but we have to bring awareness to this issue. If I were a country like North Korea that can't compete with America on a nuclear scale, if I wanted to go to war with America, it'd be very easy to create a deep fake of Joe Biden saying something that would crash the economy, or to do any number of things that would upset the world order.
Well, did you see what happened today? The thing that happened today was there was an AI-generated fake news story that showed a bomb exploding on the Pentagon.
I did not see that, no.
And it made it made a lot of real news agencies, and it sort of brought the markets down temporarily because people thought it might be real.
Yeah.
I mean, false flags.
Sure.
Everywhere.
Right. I mean, what if there's another pandemic? I mean, God forbid, I hope there's not one, but how easy would it be to destroy it? That just happened a few hours ago. You put a bunch of health officials saying that we've got another pandemic and it just came out of China or Russia or wherever. We're also globally interconnected, all these markets, right? What's going to happen when that occurs? In fact, I think that the next big wars will be something like reality wars, where people are fighting to determine what is true and what is not, and the kind of
reality wars. Great. Sounds like a new genre of television. Right?
Right?
It's like, oh my gosh, reality wars. Well, maybe that's what we're living right now.
I mean, yeah.
Because everyone's got such juxtaposed views. And you can kind of understand it, though, because if there was a crime outside, then there was a nice lady walking down the street and her purse was stolen. Mm-hmm. And there were, let's say, 10 or 15 different bystanders. Mm-hmm. You go to court in front of a jury. Mm-hmm. How many different testimonies are we going to have? However many people there were there.
Right.
They're entirely different.
Right.
Maybe our entire concept of truth is already determined by our perception and narrative, our own conditioning bias.
Sure.
So maybe the only thing that could actually be considered the whole truth would be the sum of all possible subjective perspectives.
Well, I mean, think about that it was a play and then a movie, 12 Angry Men. I mean, that's exactly what it's about. They're so sure that this person is guilty, and then they're so sure he's innocent, but it can change very, very easily. And that's what I meant about the example with January 6th with George Floyd. Here are instances in which we have video. Perhaps in that one, we don't have video in that example you give. We have video, and yet we're still trying to make sense of what really happened. And I think what may come out of this, we're beginning to see it. I heard that in China, it is mandated that all when it comes to the court when they're dealing with judicial matters, that they have to have an AI involved in every case, a computer, if you will. And so I think we're approaching a point where an AI will be a kind of godhead. So, we've read about, there's sci-fi novels.
Wow.
City of the Stars is a good example where the whole society is run by basically a godlike figure. It's an AI, it's a computer that has all this processing power. And we may be at a point where people throw up their hands and say, I don't know what reality is anymore. Please, AI, tell me what the truth is.
Okay, wow. This could take you down a rabbit hole really fast.
Yeah.
I remember going to see the movie Minority Report.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a movie theater in Mountain View, California. And right next to me, just by chance, was Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs and his son. It was like a 13-year-old young man that was there with him.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember in Minority Report, there was like this whole thing where they put this little thumb and index finger thing on. They could like scroll through pages and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of had this screen here. This is before iPhone and iPad and all that. I remember while I was watching that, this is where art imitates life or life imitates art. Steve was going like this.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the language of the gestures of using, eventually, this was 2002 or 2003 when that movie came out. So it's a full 5 years before the first iPhone. And yet all of those same commands were integrated into that system, right? So it's fascinating because in that movie, the thesis around it was, could you be tried and held, found guilty for a crime you haven't committed yet, but would likely commit because this, these three psychics that were sort of in this bath of liquid would, have a random number generator issue something out to them and then all of a sudden collapse the wave function. And you are treated as if, in a dream state, as if you had actually perpetrated the crime.
Yes.
So what does this mean? If we can use AI to cause people induce certain behaviors as a catalyst, then at some point in time in the future, you could also create predictive algorithms and say, with that inducement, and based on this set of circumstances, this person may find his only choice be to murder someone else.
Sure. Well,
so before they've even done anything, and before they've even been, had this inception placed into their brain through subliminal or other AI sort of inducing technologies, they could be tried and found guilty.
Well, with Philip K. Dick, he was obsessed with this idea of precogs, so the precognition.
Precogs, right.
And they're through most of his story, especially that one, obviously. But you said something earlier that I think definitely plays into this, right? You said earlier they have, 50-something pages on you, right?
56.
And so, right. And so we know that Facebook or these algorithms can determine your political beliefs. They can determine your religious beliefs just based on the choices you make or, what you texted or what you DM somebody, right? So like you're saying, what if we have a new ministry, some version of the ministry, like future crime unit, right? And what they do is they say, Robert goes to these sites and he does this. And, we're not going to wait around for him to kill his wife or somebody else or whatever. We're just going to arrest him now because we have...
It's like he's a cancer and we should catch cancer at stage 1.
Well, right. And by the way,
or before.
And we take it back to the narrative, right? And so you could sell this to the public under the auspices of safety. Don't we want to be a safe community? There are so many things that could be dangerous here.
Straight out of like V for Vendetta and Orwell, 1984. This idea that always under the auspices of the public benefit and the public health.
Of course.
And that's what happened during COVID.
Of course.
What a shit show.
Right. Who wants to go against that? Who wants to be unsafe, right?
Well, now conspiracy is being proven to be true. Everything that the doctors that were saying that were getting censored, deplatformed,
right?
And deplatforming, another thing. Wow,
right?
Freaking fascinating. A good example of this as well is looking to see what happened during the Canadian trucker.
Yes.
Sort of demonstrations that were going on for several weeks,
right?
And the response of the Trudeau, ministry and the administration, and they effectively just deplatformed them in a sense. It was a deplatforming, even that to the point where Americans could not contribute to the GoFundMe campaigns.
Yes. Well, I'd actually like this. This is a good segue because we tell this story in the book, and I'd like to tell it. It was the show part. I'd like to mention this aspect. And so, again, going back to this idea that we want to viscerally connect with hearts and minds. If you think about the success of the Freedom Convoy, what it did so well was it undermined the narrative once more, because we've been long told that these people were terrorists, and that they were white supremacists, which none of that stuff was true. And instead, it was a very diverse coalition of people, many of which who had actually received the vaccine. And so they were able to use their collective power to change the narrative that we tell about COVID-19. And I think it was honestly the most powerful blow to this whole COVID sham narrative. And so the story that we give in the book goes back to the story of Rosa Parks. And so most of us are familiar with the part of the story where segregation. And in 1961, she refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. But people don't know the second part of the story as well. And that is Martin Luther King Jr. and several other people came to Rosa Parks and said, our real power is our money. We can divest, we can boycott. And so they brought Montgomery to its knees by not paying for fares on these buses. They were treating them as subhumans, not going to white-owned businesses and establishments. Now, what we created in this story together is this idea that the day after, and this is magic realism, but it's meant to prove a point, to demonstrably show this. What if Rosa Parks the next day, she's in her vehicle and she goes to a gas station, a black-owned gas station, and she goes to give them the cash, the $5 for the gas, and the money disappears from her hands. And she goes to a store, and when she tries a black-owned store, she tries to pay money, the money disappears. The money disappears from the black-owned banks. This is what they're trying to do, because Justin Trudeau, under an emergency order, took the money from people's bank accounts. Anyone that donated to those causes, it could be an 80-year-old grandma who gave $15 to the cause. The next day she found that her bank account no longer worked. Her credit cards no longer worked.
So anyone in Canada that contributed got shut down on everything.
Yes. And so we can imagine a future in where people like you and I are told that we are insurgents because we wrote the book Neuromined, and our CBDC accounts don't work anymore. We can't use our programmable money anymore. We are shut out when we go to a gas station to fill up our car. We are told it's been denied. We go to a restaurant, we can't use it. We can't buy groceries. This is the grid that they're creating before our eyes.
Wow. I mean, that gets really dystopian really fast. So the pace of this is so mind-bogglingly fast, because I also think about this from the standpoint that it feels like the world right now, I mean, if you kind of ask yourself, what is going on? Everything seems so upside down. It seems so backwards, so extremely polarized. People can't even communicate. You know, brothers, fathers, sisters, mothers can't get along with their siblings, right? And their best friends on these very, perplexing and controversial topics. So when we kind of take a step back and say, what is really going on in the world right now? You can't help but notice that literally everything feels like it's just been flipped upside down. And is that a narrative itself? Are we literally being thrown into echo chambers of our own conditioning bias to meet some beneficial narrative of self-preservation for some political campaign, for some corporatocracy, for some pharmaceutical company, for some, Project Veritas? What are we basically being thrown into? And we don't even know how to protect ourselves. It reminds me when I lived in South Korea. So I lived in Korea when I first got there in like 1988. Right. Sorry, it was 87 I first got there. And while I was there, I ended up taking photographs, right? I had a camera, and some people didn't want to have their photographs taken. And I remember asking, was like, why not? Because, for some that were either kind of like, the Korean version of Shintoism, right? Or the, Korean version of Buddhism as well. They felt like if you took a photograph of them, you would steal their soul. Do we actually live in a world now where a photograph can steal your soul? Because it could steal your data.
You're right.
It could steal your image. It could steal all your information.
Yes.
Right? I have Clear. Yes, it's nice. They've got this camera system now. And it's fast. It's convenient. We've thrown it all into the bucket of convenience.
Yes.
And what we have given away under the auspices of convenience, public health, and for the public benefit is absolutely insane in my book. So how do we fight this?
Well, I think it does come back to narrative, and I think it comes back to something. Joseph Campbell was a scholar who created this concept, the hero's journey, also called the monomyth. And what he says that no matter what country you're born in, what time period, we are hardwired to understand life through storytelling. That's why we tell parables to children. But we're hardwired to understand a certain archetype of story. And it goes like this. And it's no accident that Star Wars plays out this way, because George Lucas was friends with Joseph Campbell. And so it begins in an ordinary world, and then there's an inciting incident. The ordinary world, the status quo, is thrown off. And at first, the hero, and that's a man or a woman, Luke Skywalker in this example, they refuse to call. Even though the ordinary world is not what they want, they're afraid. They're afraid, especially because the danger is so big. Imagine Darth Vader. Imagine the Empire. It's your worst nightmare, and you're all alone. But you have the help of an ally. You have a wise wizard, or you have Obi-Wan Kenobi that helps you, and you amass other allies.
A mentor.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you amass other allies like Han Solo as well. Someone's going to fight alongside with you. And then Princess Leia, someone that shows you what you're fighting for. And eventually, in this battle, in which you feel like you're going to lose, you experience the dark night of the soul. And I think that's where we are right now. It feels so dark. It feels like we're at our lowest point. But what always happens in every story, good triumph over evil. And so they have the final stage, which is called Return with the Elixir, when the hero has not only slayed
Return of the Jedi.
Right. Has not only slayed the dragon, but they get to come back to heal their tribe or community. And what I would say is, not only do we experience narratives, but we are living a hero's journey right now. We need to wake up and become the heroes we were meant to be.
Okay, so how can we bring that down to from Star Wars, right, and from the ethereal plane,
sure,
all the way down to brass tacks of living here in this 4D world?
We need to tell better stories is the first thing that I would say. We've been talking a lot about beliefs and storytelling and myths, and we need to tell a more empowering story. And one of them is the story of America. And, we've been told America is this evil place. I do not believe it. I think it's the best country this world has ever known, and that is why it's under attack. And so we need to remember that America, people still look up to America as an ideal for freedom, an ideal for not having a class system, that anyone can be who they want through hard work, and that really, in spite of what people keep saying right now, we are a diverse country. Diverse not just in the people that comprise it, but in our beliefs. And we need to go back to the marketplace of ideas, to share ideas. Even if we find them abhorrent, we need to interact with ideas and stop canceling people. And we need to remember that, again, that we are made in God's image, and to bring that back into the discussions that we have in America. And so it's been often said, if you want to have this nation, if you want to have this republic, we have to have people that are filled with morality, with integrity. And so I would encourage people to go back to those ideals. Stop buying into this belief that your neighbor is your enemy and that everyone is out to get you and then that person's a villain. Instead, I think we should try to find more commonality between other people, to find the things that we share in common, because we have a lot more in common than we have apart. Oh,
there's no doubt about that. I think right now we're on the verge of something very, very significant. It's fascinating as I'm watching, and again, I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. I, didn't vote for the current administration, and I didn't vote for the last administration either. Now, the reason is because I felt like they were too terribly polarized. But one thing I do feel right now is that there is going to be a huge day of reckoning coming, because one thing that seems to be quite clear, and it's firming up, is that our government in its current administration is quite possibly the most corrupt government we've ever seen in this country.
Yes.
Now you might say, well, wait a minute, that's because you've been believing the narrative. Maybe it's been that way all along. I don't really think so. I think that the founding fathers had these principles of a self-governing concept that they were trying to implement by establishing a republic.
Yes.
This goes right back to Plato. The founding fathers were all students of Hermetic wisdom. Founding fathers all believed that they were doing something with providence at their backs, and that they had a destiny to try to fulfill.
Yes.
Now, were there all positive aspects of this? No.
Of course.
Right. So manifest destiny led to a lot of the travesties that we saw across the plains and across all the way to the West Coast, with indigenous American people. But this concept right now, where even Stanford University is trying to stamp out the word American.
Yeah.
Are you freaking kidding me?
Yeah.
I posted that with a poll on my social media, and I copied the university on it, and they pulled it back the next day. This is clearly a propaganda campaign that's going on, where we're being forced to look at ourselves in a way that is self-loathing in its orientation. And I don't believe the world's a difficult place because people hate each other. I believe the world's a difficult place mainly because people hate themselves. And then they project that vitriol to the world around them, right? Because it's a you inverse. Whatever you are inside is what ends up getting projected to your outside world. So this notion, right, of the founding fathers having the right philosophy going into it, which I do believe. And I don't believe they were corrupt like the corruption we have in the White House right now. And I think the whole thing is going to get exposed. 9 family members that now congressional leaders actually have all of the details, the bank transfers and everything for 9 family members of the President of the United States. Let that guy fry. That's what I say. And this is disgusting, right? And it needs to basically be exposed for what it truly is.
Right.
And so here's the situation. How can we protect ourselves in this world of technocracy, of autocracy, of despotic regime? How can we actually protect ourselves in this environment?
Well, I think the first thing comes back to accountability. And so we've had rampant unaccountability for years. Going back to the Holocaust, if you think about what the Nuremberg trials were about, not that they got everybody, obviously they did not, but it sent a symbol to the world that this would not stand, that this was wrong, and that we should not repeat it. In fact, that's what we talk about now, even to this day, about the Holocaust. Never again, right? But we've had crimes in this country going back, decades, and we've had no accountability. Look at what happened after 9/11, the biggest intelligence failure of all time. How many people were prosecuted? Who lost their jobs for this? I think we know the answer to that. Look at the Iraq War, the second one. It was sold to us about weapons of mass destruction. Never found. No accountability. Thousands of Americans killed, millions of Iraqis killed.
That was corrupt too. So the Republican Party has corruption too. That was absolutely corrupt.
Both of them.
The whole Halliburton scandal. Come on.
2008, the housing crisis, the COVID narrative. Look at just what happened with Afghanistan. We left $85 billion, I think is the current estimate, of equipment over there. Who lost their jobs? Only one person was even prosecuted, if you want to call that. Because it was, I'm blanking on his name, the gentleman in the military who said that this was wrong. We left American servicemen and women there to die. There's no accountability. Look at what happened with COVID. Where's the accountability? All the people that lost their livelihoods, all the people that lost their lives.
Come on. I wrote a thing on my LinkedIn about this, and I copied Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. And I'm like, come on, give us an answer here. Did this guy actually work for Pfizer? Right. And the interesting part is I could see on the back end how many people, there were like over 150 people in the executive ranks of Pfizer that viewed that message, right? Yeah. That post that I made on LinkedIn. Where is the accountability?
Where is it? And if we don't get accountability,
it's getting wrapped into a narrative that's a counter narrative to the actual truth.
Exactly. And if we don't get this, it will continue to happen again. And why wouldn't? If I were perpetuating crimes and I'd gotten through scot-free, why wouldn't I do it? It's more decentralized power.
So in this environment, for the right amount of money, you can literally buy any truth that you want. Think about that.
You can.
But you can only spend your money where you're allowed to spend your money in a social credit system. So so this is also new because we could never control with a cash-based society in the past. We could never control how money could be spent, right? Because every dollar was the same as every other dollar as long as it's not counterfeit.
Sure.
But now with CBDC, you can not only control the narrative through big technocracy, you can also control consumption of everything.
Programmable money. But I have another solution with this too, which is this. If you think about their great idea, the Great Reset, right? They want to reset it. Well, I created a Substack called The Great Wake Up. And to me, even if they have all the money, even if they have all this stuff here, they don't have human consciousness. They don't have our minds. And this is a war for hearts and minds. We need to wake up more people. Going back to the Freedom Convoy, why was that so powerful? That was a bottom-up reaction to what happened there. It wasn't politicians mandating that people get out in the streets or whatever. This was a spontaneous groundswell and uprising of people that said, no, this is not right. And I think that the more that we do things like this, the more that we have podcasts like this, the more that we have books like this, the more that we entertain these ideas and we discuss them freely, the marketplace of ideas, the more people wake up and they say no. They say, this is not okay. I do not want this for my children. I do not want it for my children's children. And I do believe this is going to be a generational effort. So if you look at TikTok for one example right now, we've been having this, this hysterics about TikTok, about them data mining our republic. But that is a problem. I'm not going to dispute that. But there's a more insidious problem that we don't talk about. And it goes back to Yuri Bezmenov. And he talked about this. He was a defector from the KGB. And this was in the 80s. And he said, you think that spies are there and they're stealing microfilm and they're killing bad guys. That's not what spies do. What spies do is they do ideological subversion. And I heard a chilling statistic just last week that 2/3 of our teenagers are on TikTok and about 20% of them are on it for more than 8 hours a day. Their brains are being turned to mush. They can't watch movies for 2 hours because they can't think long form. And now we have ChatGPT that's going to write their books for them or write their articles or read their stuff for them. We need to take back our minds. And we need to say, no, you don't get to have my mind space, right? You don't get to have me looking at TikTok. We need to think generationally about how do we help give good ideas and good myths and narratives and cultural ideas to return our republic. And it's going to take more than a generation to do this, but we have to start now to change the story that we tell about ourselves.
Oh, we're solidly in the stupefaction of the United States of America right now. It's mind-boggling. I see the lack of education, the commentary, the types of questions I get on social media are kind of like, wow, super demonstrative of the fact that we are becoming less and less and less intelligent. And it is possible. Aristophanes figured out, and Pythagoras, I believe as well, did too, that the earth was round. Okay. The way he did it is he had one pole of the same height in Thebes and the other one in Alexandria. They measured the shadow that was cast at the same time of day, or 800 kilometers apart. And from that, they were able to figure out the arc of the earth is 7 degrees. This was the genius thing. And they figured out based on the distance, right, that it turns out that the earth would have, if a perfect sphere, exactly about a 40,000 kilometer circumference. That's correct. They figured this out like thousands of years ago. And yet we talk about the time of Christopher Columbus and people saying, no, the earth is flat. And now here we are again. And that was, at the time of Christopher Columbus, that was the time of the Italian Renaissance. Right? We remember the story of Columbus, whether you think he's a villain or not, right? We want to change history and say, oh, he's only this all negative.
Sure.
But he took the risk, went over. He didn't discover America, no, but he discovered it for what was considered at that time, the traditional or the European world, right? And the earth wasn't flat. So here we are again. It's now, that was 1492. 500 plus years since that time. And people are talking about the earth being flat again. And it's mind-boggling to me because this can actually happen. We can, as a society and as a civilization, become stupid.
Yes.
And it's happening around us every day with all these narrative changes and everything. The fact that people think, oh, I don't need math because math's a waste. What do I need math for? I can use ChatGPT for that.
Sure. Well, I'll go one further. So, you and I are old enough to remember. I mean, when I was in school, I wasn't using calculators until I was in high school. I meet people right now, they can't do long division in their heads. They can't do multiplication in their heads. Now, think about this from a reading and writing standpoint. It's proven that London cab drivers just a few decades ago had enlarged hippocampi, the part of your brain that deals with space. And because they had to memorize 25,000 different roads. Before that, you were talking about Christopher Columbus. Before that, they didn't have any maps, right? They're using the stars. They're using the moon to find their way. I would imagine if you've been in an Uber car in the last 2 years, none of those people can find anywhere where they're going without their phone. And now we're going to take away reading and writing. I read an article in MIT Review that was saying what a great thing it is to have ChatGPT. Instead of interacting with the great books, our young people can be like producers. They can just read the commentary of 20 different synopses that the ChatGPT gives to you. Well, that's going to dumb down our population even further. But there's something special that happens with writing. You get to objectify your thoughts. Not only do you bring them in, you think them through, but there's an alchemy that happens when you're writing them. And it's like telepathy, because we can still interact with people's writings hundreds of years ago. And now we're going to take that away from people. Well, in fact, we're going to do it voluntarily. Young people are going to say, hey, I don't want to do something hard. I'm going to use ChatGPT to write my papers for me. And so we're becoming a weaker society, a dumber society. It's just the point in time when we cannot afford to do so.
It's almost as if all the issues in society today are so complex that somehow humanity has found itself in the position where it can no longer manage the pace of change and this degree of complexity, which is fascinating to me. And I think it's partly happened because we've gone down this road of hyper-specialization. We no longer have philosophers. We no longer have, luckily we're starting to see a resurgence of what we would consider philosophy with all these series of podcasts that are coming out with people, some of which are true philosophers, some of which aren't necessarily. But the role of a philosopher was always to be able to connect the dots,
right?
Find the patterns that exist across so many different subsets of society,
right?
And then derive meaning from it. And with that meaning, also fashion a simple solution, because complex problems aren't solved with more complexity. Complex problems can only be solved with the simple solutions. And where do you think we are right now from that perspective? Obviously, there's not all that's bad about AI. There's a lot of stuff about AI that's pretty amazing, right? But where does the role of the human being go? We don't want to be in some dystopian, soulless society. That's not what I want for my kids.
No. When we had lunch today, we were talking about this idea that all of this we're experiencing all around us is for our growth, right? And we were talking about the Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. I believe, contrary to the narrative that we have been told that we are consumers and that we should be buying things. You're going back to the war on terror. Right after that happened, George Bush said, go out and buy more stuff, right? We were being told this is our purpose, but I don't think that's our purpose at all. I think that we are being hit with all of these challenges at once, everything all at once, just like that movie, right?
Yeah.
All of it at once, but it's to grow us, to become better, greater versions than we ever imagined. If you think about anything that you've ever done in your life that was challenging, whether it was starting a company, maybe it was a fitness routine, writing a book, whatever it is, how did you feel afterwards? The sense of accomplishment. To me, the great work is what we're doing right now. In spite of all of these things, these almost unbelievable challenges that we face, we can combat this. I'm an optimist too. I think we win in the end, but it begins with changing the story we tell about ourselves.
I think love wins also. It's funny. A few weeks ago, only about a week or so ago, I was honored by Cal State Fullerton University with a Lifetime Achievement Award for leadership. And it forced me really to be introspective and reflective on my own life. And of course, I kind of started off my talk with the joke, but it was true, that as soon as they told me I was being considered for a Lifetime Achievement Award, the first thing I did was to drive to CVS and buy some hair dye. And I'm like, wait, Lifetime Achievement? What the hell? I'm not that old. But I started to realize something very profound as I started thinking about how to put together my remarks. And what I came to was that my whole life had been filled with challenges and difficulties. And when I think about the teachers that were easy, I don't even remember their names. And the most difficult of challenges I faced were my greatest teachers. So there's a part of me that really wonders, because I do believe that, what we're living in here is a holograph of a simulation that is tied to our own conditioning biases. And it's about breaking down those biases and breaking the ego that then allows us to open the heart. And as I thought through all of that, I realized that the people that I really needed to thank the most were my so-called enemies in life. The nemesis that I faced time and time again in my own hero's journey. And I, of course, thanked all the people in my life, my family, et cetera, who, helped get me to, achieve the things that I've achieved in life. But I said I would be remiss if I didn't also thank all of the villains
Yes.
if I didn't thank all of the difficulties, all of the challenges, because those are the things that taught me the very most, expanded my heart the most, and expanded my perception the most. So I said to myself as well, I'm like, well, you know, because of all of that challenge, all that difficulty, I've had a lot in my career. It got me to a point where I now realize that I am what I've been looking for. I always looked for a mentor. I always looked for a teacher, and I had many along the way. But life in general and the difficulties of life, as much as the simple times have been the greatest teacher for me. And now I've learned how to turn to myself, because we can often be disappointed by looking up to somebody else, no matter who that person is throughout history. So maybe that's the purpose that we have here, which is, you know, I do believe that each one of us, our greatest value is our uniqueness. And that's why I believe our data is so important. Our data is an extension of our own individuality.
Sure.
Maybe each of us are just the eyes through which the universe perceives itself.
I find it interesting that at this moment in time, we've never had so much comfort, right? We sleep in very comfortable beds. We have very comfortable clothes. We have cars that are marvels of comfort, right? But at the same time, we need hardship. We need struggle. I mean, I think a lot. I happen to be watching Yellowstone in 1883. I don't know if you're watching.
Love those shows.
They're wonderful shows. So Yellowstone especially, let's talk about that one for a moment. You know, I think about what those, again, talking about cultural myths, we're talking about stories. You know, what's the story it's telling you? It's telling John Dutton, what's he telling his kids? That life is hard, but it's worthwhile. It's worth the fight. You get up at 4 a.m. in the morning, right? And you work hard, right? And it gives your life meaning and purpose. On the other hand, culturally, what are we being told? Everything should be convenient. You're talking about what we give up for convenience, right? I think we've got to get away from convenience. Go and do what you're saying. Allow the hard stuff.
It's the tyranny of convenience.
Right? But it's like iron sharpens iron, right? Let it sharpen your soul, who you are. And then imagine if that scales and more people do the hard stuff, right? They confront their shadow self and the difficult parts of their personality that they don't want to face.
That's very fascinating. So what you're saying is that in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, what would be the hero without the villain?
Exactly.
What would be the hero without the challenge?
Right.
What would be the hero without the damsel in distress?
You need them.
Or the heroine without, the challenges that she has to face.
Right. Well, even now I'm going back to Alan Watts. He talks about this. You need the white with the black, or whatever polarity you want. For us to understand anything, we have to know its opposite. We have to think about that way, right? We have to think about the dualism, right? To understand anything. But I think so much of us, myself included, we spend our time avoiding that which causes us pain. Pain doesn't feel good. Suffering doesn't feel good. But I think if we begin to change our approach to that, we can make ourselves stronger. So like Wim Hof, for example, I love that guy, and I'm reading his book right now. He talks about cold showers, and there's nothing.
I take cold showers every day.
Me too. But I didn't until about 8 months ago. And there's nothing I hate more than being cold. But I do it. I'm up to 2 minutes every day. And I say to myself, as the cold water's pouring down, no matter what happens today, it's going to be better than this. But it begins to make you stronger. It opens your vascular system, right? It makes you healthier. You get sick less because you're doing the difficult things. And maybe that's what we need to do more culturally, do the difficult things.
You know what I started to do? I've been taking cold showers for probably 15 years, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it had a huge impact on me. I was learning Ayurvedic, right? Mm-hmm. I was learning the whole Ayurvedic philosophy, and I'm Pitta, right? So my hands are always hot. I'm always hot. Mm-hmm. And so I learned, even though I love spicy food, I shouldn't eat spicy food. So it basically said, don't eat spicy food. It's like adding fire to fire, right? And it does upset my stomach, but I love the taste of it. Yeah. And I'm like, I just can't stop eating it. And then the other thing is to take cold showers was one of the things for Pitta, the recommendations for Pitta. So I started doing it, and I noticed a huge difference. First of all, I never drink coffee in the morning. I never felt the need to drink coffee in the morning, but this really woke me up more than anything else, right? It invigorates you, right? You put the right music combination with it, it's super invigorating. But for 10 years, I took cold showers. And then a few years ago, I started realizing that I could change my perception of the cold water. I could literally trick myself standing there in cold water to believe it's warm. Try it.
That's what he does in the videos. I mean, that's what I think he hiked, I think it was Everest or something like that, in bare feet or something crazy. I mean, the mind is so powerful. Again, talking about potential, right? You think about human potential. Going back to John Dutton, going back to that ranch, I don't know did you ever read Lonesome Dove?
Yes, long time ago though. Mm-hmm.
So going back to Navigators, in that book, they go through into Mexico, they go from the Rio Grande, and then they go up to Montana, and that's where they end up. And they build, when they finally get there, they get all the steer up there, and then they build a house, right? They build a whole ranch, these guys, and they're navigating not with maps, but by the stars, and they know where things are in the grass, and these powers that we don't have anymore, the power that you have of your mind to be able to interpret and change the temperature. I think that we have so much untapped potential. We are living these lives of crazy comfort, right, and convenience, but instead we have so much more potential. We could be doing those things with our brains. We could be telling ourselves different stories that we could, again, go and be one with nature, where we could guide ourselves based by the stars. We don't have to use GPS, but if we just have to change the way that we think about life and reality.
It reminds me of one of my favorite songs by the 80s and 90s band In Excess. And it's a song titled Never Tear Us Apart.
Mm-hmm. I love that song.
And one of my favorite lines in it says, because we all have wings, but some of us don't know why.
Yeah.
And I think there's something beautiful in all of this. So yes, amid this whole dystopian environment and all the fuckery, for lack of a better term,
sure,
that seems to be going on, it also leaves place and space for the hero.
Yes.
And the heroine.
Yes.
And the heroine, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a beautiful story that has yet to be played out.
Mm-hmm.
And we can find and realize that we are what we've been looking for all along.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be a function of us going through this path.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited to see where the world is going to take us, because despite all the challenges and everything else, it reminds me also of the movie Batman Begins, when Two-Face gets half his face burned off, and then he says, hope that you live long enough to defeat the villain, but not so long that you become the villain. Mm-hmm. Because every villain always believes they're the hero.
Of course.
And this is, I think, the thing that all of us are having to come to terms with. The thing that we are calling out as the most ethical choice is really just our point of advantage, not our vantage point. Mm-hmm. It's the thing that advantages us the most, what we believe will advantage us the most. Mm-hmm. And, seeing what's happening in society with technocracy, with all the change, we need to become aware of how important the individual is. I was just asked recently in another podcast, what is the most valuable asset in the universe? Mm-hmm. And the answer I gave the interviewer, Andre Ducom was his name, was you. Mm-hmm. You are. Mm-hmm. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, your uniqueness. Mm-hmm. Your ability to see the universe through your eyes of experience, through your eyes of genetics, through your own individual light signature is the most valuable thing, I believe, to the universe. Mm-hmm. It's providing valuable data back to this expanding notion of information. Mm-hmm. I believe information is the foundational basis of all that is. That informs geometry, which is the coherence of that information. And then the universe is formed off of that. Separation between the conscious mind, the subconscious mind, creating a you and a you inverse. Mm-hmm. So then you can actually realize that you're on your own hero's journey. Mm-hmm. And you coming back to yourself. I think when people go through a spiritual path, what often happens is they get to this stage of crisis. Mm-hmm. They start off in building up their persona, and the extreme form of building up their mask results in narcissism. Mm-hmm. That could be covert or overt narcissism. And that extreme form of building up that mask then gets torn down. We have an experience like we had with COVID, right? Where the metaphor of the mask and the persona was all around us. Persona just means the word mask in Latin. Mm-hmm. So for 2 years, we're all wearing masks and then taking off the mask. Mm-hmm. It was almost like a butterfly going through its metamorphosis, or a dragonfly going through its molting process. Mm-hmm. And then you come out on the other side and realize that you had wings. Mm-hmm. And now hopefully you have the meaning and understanding to realize why they were there all along and what you can do with them. A dragonfly, it's interesting. Dragonfly starts off as a little bug and it'll climb up this reed underwater. It never knows that it can go out in the outside air. Mm-hmm. It's living underwater. Mm-hmm. It might even see dragonflies flying above it in a still pond. And then one day it climbs up this reed. It doesn't really know why. And it goes through this molting process that lasts several weeks. And then it finally emerges out of it, and it's got wings and can fly. It's rainbow colored and iridescent and beautiful. And then it gets out of the pond and it's looking down at its former friends. People like Jim Carrey who are like, I'm the actor who was once known as Jim Carrey. I've changed my name to Divine One, you know, or One Divine, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And actually, the true awakening process culminates when you realize the power and strength and value of your own individuality. That we, each of us in this universal song of the universe, have a note to play. And that note is entirely consistent with what consciousness needs and wants for it to expand and grow through our eyes of perception. So that gives me great comfort when I look at things, because I can easily get stuck in this notion of, whoa, dystopian world. How do I get out of this? And it's interesting because, yes, obviously there are things we can do to start really valuing our individuality. We can protect ourselves digitally. We can practice digital hygiene, which our book gives a good outline of how to do that. And there'll be new technologies coming as well to help us. I believe that decentralization and blockchain holds a promise for individuals to be able to impact the world around them and protect their data. Because in this next dystopian stage, this hyper challenge within this matrix game of the hero's journey, one of the things that will happen very likely is deep fakes of you on voting registries. So you think you've got your choice, you go to vote, and all of a sudden your ballot's already been turned in. Do you really think that's that far away from coming?
Nope, not at all.
I think it's absolutely just around the corner, and you won't even be able to prove that it wasn't you.
Sure.
So just as you said, they'll have pictures of you going to the voting registry. There you went. You turned in this. They'll have video surveillance that'll basically show that it was you. How do we deal with this? So there are some things we can do, and that's one of the things that we've dedicated our efforts here, at Crown Sterling to do, to be able to safeguard you. Homomorphic, one-time pad encryptions on blockchain, et cetera, that are only controlled and operated by you. Nobody else. That's self-sovereignty.
Well, I completely agree with what you're saying, that we have outdated modes of leadership and government that have kept us down for way too long.
And corrupt.
And
proven corrupt.
Deeply corrupt.
Agency, and that's what we have, right? We have representative democracy. We don't have democracy. We have representative democracy. And that representation is where all the corruption sits.
Absolutely.
Like congressmen being able to, flout any rules and regulations related to things like inside information. What the fuck?
I couldn't agree more. And I think that whether it's blockchain or any of these technologies, the aspect of decentralization, to take away this centralized control, that's how we begin to take our power back. And so I'm all for those things. I have some reservations about the different ways in which they can be penetrated and the different ways in which the governments may misuse them or bad actors. But overall, I think this is the approach. I think decentralization is the approach. But there's one other thing that you mentioned there I just want to come back to before it, which is something that doesn't get talked about enough: bravery. I think we have to go back to remembering why this is such an important point of being human, is to emphasize bravery.
Brave was one of the words on the Stanford list to get rid of it.
Really?
Yeah, along with American and brave, because they're thinking, right, in their woke culture.
Yeah.
Right, which woke does not mean awakened. It's totally different.
Sure.
Woke is, completely anathema to awakened, because it's leading to more judgment. And truly awakened means you are able to step back away from judgment.
Sure.
But yes, the word brave was on that list. And along with white paper and a lot of other words that were no longer allowed, there was not even a replacement for the word brave. So you could think, well, what about a synonym for the word brave, like courage or something like that? No. Because they said that I can't remember exactly the terminology they used, but they said that the term bravery incited a savage culture. Savage was the word they used.
Okay.
That bravery is something for savages.
Well, you see that it's such a smart and sophisticated weapon. And I want to say, to their credit, the people that are behind this are not stupid people. They're very creative. Unfortunately, they see things. I mean, to your point, they see themselves as heroes. I'm not going to dispute that for a moment.
Oh, they see themselves as like neuroplasticity gods.
Courage or bravery is like a muscle. The first time that you do it, the first time that you step out of the sheep, of the herd or whatever, and you do something that requires courage, is terrifying, right? It doesn't mean that you're not afraid. You're still afraid generally, right? You're still afraid, but you do it anyway. But it's a muscle. And the more that you say no, the more that you stand up for yourself, the more that you develop this bravery, the stronger it gets. But there's another part of it too, which is this: courage is contagious. You see one person do it, you see one person stand up for themselves, and it goes on and it's additive, right? And so we need to encourage this more and more. And I think especially for young people, right now, they're up against some very, very difficult things, and we need to show them the importance of courage and allow that to be contagious, a good social contagion.
So what a pleasure to have you here, Michael. Your mind is just a playground of looking at different perspectives and viewpoints, because you have such a broad lexicon as well as experiential sort of database to pull from. All these different stories and everything, which I think are fascinating and can really speak to us in pictures. You have this amazing way to speak in a way that is illustrative of exactly what it is you're trying to convey. And I really thank you for that. Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.